Billionaire CEO Lila Harrington never imagined that following her own janitor home would unravel everything she thought she understood about success, loyalty, and the true meaning of power. Yet on a cold Thursday night, as she sat alone in her darkened corner office 38 floors above Seattle, replaying grainy security footage of Daniel Reyes slipping into Ardent Dynamics' restricted development wing for the third time that week, she felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with corporate risk and everything to do with instinct. The boardroom whispers had started quietly, an engineer noticing a workstation slightly moved, a security analyst flagging after-hours server access, a junior executive mentioning that the night janitor seemed to linger too long near prototype labs. But Lila had built a billion-dollar artificial intelligence empire by never ignoring patterns, and Daniel Reyes had become one. At 44, Daniel was an unassuming presence in Ardent's gleaming glass tower, a single father with tired eyes and steady hands who pushed his cleaning cart through polished corridors after most employees had gone home. His navy uniform pressed neatly despite its age, his demeanor polite but reserved. He had worked the night shift for 3 years, rarely called in sick, never complained, and always finished early. Yet security footage showed him entering the Advanced Neural Systems corridor at 11:47 p.m., standing at an unused terminal for 27 minutes, and exiting with something small tucked into his pocket. What do we know about him? Lila asked her head of security, Marcus Lee, earlier that afternoon, her voice even but edged with steel, and Marcus had shrugged, sliding a thin employee file across her desk. Daniel Reyes, divorced, one daughter aged 9, prior employment listed as contract technical consultant, with no elaboration, no criminal record, no red flags. Just a man who seemed to have drifted quietly into custodial work. The file felt incomplete, and Lila despised incomplete data. With Ardent Dynamics preparing to launch its most ambitious AI integration platform, a system projected to redefine predictive modeling across healthcare and finance, any breach could cost billions, and Lila, who had clawed her way from a scholarship kid in rural Oregon to one of the youngest self-made billionaires in tech, did not allow vulnerability inside her walls. She trusted algorithms more than people, spreadsheets more than sentiment, and yet something about Daniel's movements did not align with the profile of industrial espionage. For if he were stealing proprietary code, why move so methodically, so openly, as if unaware of surveillance? That question kept her in the office long after her executive team left for dinners and galas, and when Daniel's shift ended at 10 p.m., Lila did something she had not done in years. She acted on curiosity instead of protocol. Changing into jeans and a plain black jacket she kept for impromptu gym visits, she exited through the private elevator and slipped into her sedan, maintaining 3 cars' distance as Daniel's aging silver pickup truck pulled away from the illuminated corporate district and into neighborhoods her executives rarely visited, past artisan coffee shops and waterfront condos, deeper into older streets lined with flickering streetlights and weathered storefronts. Her heart pounded not from fear but from the unfamiliar sensation of stepping outside controlled variables. And after 20 minutes, Daniel parked beside a modest brick building with chipped blue paint and a banner that read East Harbor Youth Innovation Center, retrieving a worn backpack and a plastic storage bin from his truck before disappearing inside. Lila waited 5 minutes before following, telling herself she was protecting her company, though the sight through the window stopped her mid-step. Daniel stood at the front of a cramped classroom filled with second-hand desks and mismatched chairs, setting up refurbished laptops while teenagers filtered in, greeting each by name with a warmth Lila had never seen in Ardent's sterile hallways. She moved quietly to the hallway, listening as his voice carried through the partially opened door, confident and precise. Nothing like the silent custodian who emptied trash bins under fluorescent lights, and on the whiteboard behind him, he sketched a complex systems diagram, explaining algorithmic efficiency and memory optimization in language both accessible and sophisticated. Code isn't just instructions, he told the students, his marker gliding across the board. It's responsibility. Every line affects someone's life, and the teenagers leaned forward, eyes intent, typing as he moved between them, offering guidance that suggested deep mastery rather than hobbyist enthusiasm. Lila felt the ground of her assumptions shift as she watched him troubleshoot a data structure error in seconds, referencing principles typically taught in advanced university courses, and when a younger child approached timidly asking about a broken laptop, Daniel knelt without hesitation, opening the casing with practiced familiarity and explaining each component as though unveiling a treasure map. It became clear that the storage bin he had carried from Arden did not contain stolen drives, but discarded equipment, carefully cleaned and repaired, given new purpose in a room that smelled faintly of solder and hope. Lila's pulse slowed, replaced by something closer to disbelief, as she realized the man she had suspected of corporate betrayal was, in fact, quietly building a future for children who might otherwise never touch a line of code. And when class ended and Daniel stayed behind to stack chairs and speak with a worried mother about scholarship opportunities, Lila stepped back into the shadows, wrestling with a question more unsettling than sabotage. How had she failed to see this? The billionaire who prided herself on recognizing potential had overlooked it sweeping her floors each night, and as Daniel exited the center and paused under the streetlight to check his phone before driving away, unaware that his employer had witnessed the secret architecture of his evenings, Lila understood that the real risk to her company might not be espionage at all but blindness, the kind that measures value by title and salary rather than substance. And as she returned to her car, watching the glow of the youth center fade in her rearview mirror, she sensed that following Daniel Reyes home had set in motion a reckoning she was not prepared for, one that would challenge her definitions of power, success, and what it truly meant to lead. What Lila Harrington uncovered the next morning would shake her more than any potential data breach ever could, because the quiet janitor she had followed across town was not merely volunteering at a struggling community center. He was a man the tech industry had once celebrated, then erased. By 7 a.m., she was seated at the head of the long obsidian conference table in her private executive suite, sunlight cutting through the glass walls as a confidential background report lay open before her. Thicker this time, no longer the thin HR file that had dismissed Daniel Reyes as a custodial afterthought. What her investigative team uncovered told a very different story. 10 years earlier, Daniel had been listed as Dr. Daniel Alejandro Reyes, Senior Systems Architect at Helixion Biotech, one of the earliest companies integrating artificial intelligence into diagnostic medicine, and his name appeared on multiple patents tied to neural learning frameworks, foundational technology that companies like Ardent Dynamics now built upon. Archived interviews described him as brilliant, ethically uncompromising, and a generational mind in AI safety architecture. Yet 5 years ago his presence in the industry abruptly vanished. The deeper report detailed the reason. Daniel had discovered falsified clinical testing data embedded within a predictive health algorithm that was being rushed to market to secure investor funding, and when internal complaints were ignored, he became a whistleblower. Helixion's board retaliated swiftly, terminating his employment for breach of loyalty and quietly blacklisting him through industry channels. And although a later lawsuit ruled partially in his favor, awarding a modest settlement, the damage to his professional reputation was irreversible. No major tech firm would touch him. Recruiters stopped returning calls. Conference invitations evaporated. Around the same time, medical records confirmed that Daniel's wife, Marisol, had died after a brief battle with aggressive lymphoma, leaving him alone to raise their daughter Sophia, then only 4 years old. Within 12 months, he had lost his career, his spouse, and his standing in the industry he helped shape. Lila leaned back in her leather chair, absorbing the weight of it, feeling something unfamiliar press against her controlled composure, shame. She had built Ardent Dynamics with ruthless clarity, cutting underperformers without hesitation, prioritizing speed and scale over sentiment. Yet here was a man who had sacrificed everything to protect patients he would never meet, and she had reduced him to a security concern. Before she could fully process the revelation, her assistant burst in with urgent news. The integration team had discovered a catastrophic flaw in Ardent's upcoming launch platform, a cascading memory failure buried deep within the adaptive neural infrastructure. The issue threatened to corrupt large-scale data modeling, and if exposed publicly, would devastate investor confidence just 72 hours before launch. Within minutes, the executive floor descended into controlled chaos. Engineers arguing over patches, the CTO insisting on delaying deployment, the CFO calculating potential market losses that stretched into the billions, and Lila stood at the center of it, outwardly calm, inwardly aware that every eye in the building measured her capacity to navigate crisis. Solutions were proposed and dismissed. Temporary workarounds introduced new vulnerabilities. Tension sharpened into blame. And in the reflection of the boardroom glass, Lila noticed Daniel pushing his cart past the hallway, pausing for half a second as if sensing the strain inside. On impulse, a rare departure from her procedural instincts, she stepped out. "Daniel," she called evenly, and he turned, respectful as always, eyes steady but guarded. "May I speak with you?" The request alone caused murmurs among nearby executives. Inside her office, Lila closed the door and met his gaze directly. "I know who you are," she said without accusation, and for the briefest moment something flickered across his face. Not fear, but weariness. "I assume you're referring to Helix Ion," he replied quietly. Lila nodded. "We have a systems failure in our neural architecture. I believe you may recognize it." There was no arrogance in his response, only measured caution. "May I see the logs?" She turned the monitor toward him. As Daniel read through the diagnostic data, his posture shifted subtly. The janitor receded, the architect emerged. His eyes sharpened, scanning code with practiced fluency, fingers hovering before he asked permission with a glance to touch the keyboard. And when she nodded, he began typing, not tentatively, but with surgical precision, navigating layers of infrastructure her senior engineers had spent months constructing. "You're looking at the wrong layer," he said after several minutes, voice calm despite the gravity. "The adaptive shell isn't failing. The underlying memory allocation protocol is unstable under scale stress. You patched around it instead of redesigning the foundation." Lila felt a chill. He was correct, and he knew it almost immediately. Within 20 minutes, Daniel isolated the root cause, a recursive compression mechanism interacting unpredictably with real-time data expansion, and outlined a structural correction rather than a superficial patch. "It can be stabilized before launch," he concluded, "but it requires access to the full code base and cooperation from your engineering team." Lila made her decision without consulting anyone. She escorted Daniel into the boardroom, ignoring stunned expressions as the man in custodial uniform approached the digital display wall filled with high-level schematics. "Mr. Reyes will be assisting us," she announced firmly, cutting off the CTO's protest with a single look. For the next 40 hours, Daniel worked alongside Arden's top developers, mapping systemic vulnerabilities, rewriting segments of legacy architecture, explaining not only what to change, but why the flaw existed in the first place. Exhaustion blurred faces around the table, yet Daniel remained composed, methodical, patient even under pressure, and more than once an engineer who had initially dismissed him fell silent mid-argument as his solution proved irrefutable. Lila observed not only his brilliance, but his leadership, how he corrected without humiliating, guided without ego, and credited junior engineers when breakthroughs emerged. At 3:17 a.m. on the final night, the revised framework stabilized under stress testing. The catastrophic failure had been eliminated, and performance metrics improved beyond original projections. A hush filled the room, followed by cautious applause. Launch day arrived without incident. Arden's platform performed flawlessly. Stock prices surged 12% by closing bell. Financial analysts praised the company's remarkable resilience. None of them knew how close it had come to collapse. As celebrations erupted across the executive floor, Lila stood alone in her office overlooking the city, aware that the real revelation was not the avoided disaster, but the man who had quietly prevented it. She thought of the youth center, of teenagers leaning forward as Daniel spoke about responsibility in code, of a whistleblower who had chosen ethics over prestige, and she realized the flaw within Arden had mirrored a deeper flaw within herself, a blindness to value that did not wear tailored suits. That evening, as Daniel resumed his custodial shift as though nothing extraordinary had happened, Lila understood that the next decision she made would define not just the company's future, but her own capacity for growth, because she had followed him once out of suspicion, and now she stood at the threshold of following him towards something far more transformative. The morning after Arden Dynamics' flawless launch, when headlines praised innovation and investors applauded resilience, Lila Harrington stood before the entire company knowing that the real story had unfolded in the shadows, and that the man responsible for saving billions in valuation was, at that very moment, emptying recycling bins on the 22nd floor. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for noon in the main atrium, a soaring glass chamber where product unveilings and shareholder announcements typically took place, and employees gathered expecting celebration. Instead, Lila stepped onto the stage with a gravity that quieted the room almost instantly. 3 days ago, she began, her voice steady but stripped of its usual sharp corporate polish. Arden faced a systems failure that could have compromised everything we've built. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, and she allowed the pause to settle before continuing. The reason we stand here successful today is because someone in this company saw what we did not. She scanned the crowd until her eyes found Daniel Reyes standing near the back wall in his Navy custodial uniform, hands folded loosely in front of him as if hoping not to be noticed. "Daniel," she said clearly, and hundreds of heads turned as he hesitated before stepping forward, confusion evident but composure intact. Murmurs swelled. "The janitor?" And Lila gestured for him to join her on stage. When he did, the contrast was stark. Billionaire CEO in tailored charcoal suit beside a man whose name badge still read facility support, yet the room felt subtly recalibrated. "Many of you know Daniel as part of our maintenance staff," Lila continued. "What you may not know is that he was once a senior systems architect whose foundational work helped shape the very frameworks we build upon today." The atrium grew silent. She spoke of his past carefully but honestly, of Helix Ion, of the whistleblowing, of the cost of integrity, and though she did not dramatize it, the weight of what he had endured hung heavy in the air. "This week," she said, turning slightly toward him, "Daniel identified and resolved a structural flaw that our executive engineering team could not." The statement was not accusatory but revelatory, and when applause began, it was hesitant at first, then building, then rising into something sustained and sincere. Daniel shifted uncomfortably and used to public recognition, and when the sound subsided, Lila faced him directly. "On behalf of Arden Dynamics," she said, "I offer you a formal position as Senior Director of Systems Architecture, effective immediately." Gasps followed. The offer was prestigious, lucrative, long overdue by any merit-based measure. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He looked out over the crowd, engineers, assistants, interns, executives, and then back at Lila, gratitude in his expression but also resolve. "That is generous," he replied quietly into the microphone, his voice carrying farther than anyone expected. "But I can't accept." A stunned silence fell. Lila had prepared for resistance, but not refusal. Daniel continued, steady and calm. 5 years ago, I lost a career I believed defined me. What I gained instead was clarity. The work I do at East Harbor isn't a hobby. It's not charity. It's the most important architecture I've ever built. He spoke of students who had never owned a computer, of parents learning digital literacy alongside their children, of the waiting list that grew longer each month because resources were scarce. "Those kids don't need another executive," he said. "They need opportunity." The words landed not as criticism, but as truth. Lila absorbed them, recognizing in his refusal the same uncompromising integrity that had once cost him everything. She stepped closer to the microphone again, her next decision forming not from strategy decks, but conviction. "Then perhaps we've been offering the wrong role," she said thoughtfully. Arden Dynamics will establish a fully funded community technology initiative, beginning with East Harbor Youth Innovation Center as our flagship partner. The crowd stirred. "We will provide equipment, infrastructure, scholarships, internship pathways, and paid volunteer hours for our employees. And we will need a director of community systems development to lead it." She extended her hand toward him. "Daniel Reyes, if your mission is building people, then let us amplify it." This time, when he looked at her, there was no hesitation. The applause that followed was not polite. It was transformative, as if the company itself recognized a shift in identity. Within months, the initiative expanded beyond a single neighborhood. 3 additional innovation labs opened across the city, staffed by Arden engineers who once measured success solely in product releases, but now mentored teenagers after work, and Daniel moved between both worlds with quiet equilibrium, still humble, still grounded, but finally positioned where his expertise and his purpose intersected. Lila visited the centers frequently, at first to ensure measurable outcomes, then because she found herself drawn to the energy, the raw curiosity, the absence of corporate pretense, and she watched as her own worldview expanded beyond shareholder returns. One evening she arrived unannounced and saw Daniel kneeling beside a 12-year-old struggling to debug a robotics script, his patience unwavering, explaining recursion with the same care he had once applied to saving her company's launch. And she realized that leadership did not always announce itself with titles or valuations. It revealed itself in impact. Their conversations gradually shifted from logistical updates to philosophy, about ethics and artificial intelligence, about access as the new frontier of equality, about what kind of legacy truly mattered. And in Daniel's grounded presence, Lila found a counterbalance to the relentless pace that had defined her adulthood. At the formal unveiling of the expanded East Harbor campus, a new plaque was mounted at the entrance, reading "Built on Integrity, Powered by Opportunity." And as families gathered alongside ardent executives, as students demonstrated projects ranging from health monitoring apps to environmental sensors, Lila addressed the crowd with a clarity she had not possessed a year earlier. "Success without purpose is fragile," she said. "We almost learned that the hard way." She glanced at Daniel standing nearby, Sophia at his side, pride shining in her young eyes. True innovation begins when we recognize value where we least expect it. Later, as dusk settled and children laughed in the courtyard illuminated by newly installed solar lights, Daniel approached her quietly. "You didn't have to follow me that night," he said with a faint smile. Lila returned it. "I'm glad I did. Because suspicion had led to understanding, and understanding had led to transformation, not just of a company, but of a leader who had once believed power was measured in dominance rather than in doors open for others." As they stood watching the next generation experiment fearlessly with technology that once felt unreachable, Lila understood that the greatest return on investment was not found on trading floors, but in changed trajectories. And the billionaire, who had followed a single dad janitor home, had discovered that the most valuable architecture in the world was built not from code, but from courage.